Hello, welcome to my channel. This is Style with Ufoma Moluru, and I want to show you the way I make my own dresses. So it's just my perspective. So for today's tutorial, I want to make a yoke kaftan dress. So what you need for this tutorial is your Ankara fabric, some satin, some tulle material, your lining, scissors, your ruler, and a tape rule. So don't forget you need to subscribe so you keep seeing my videos as I post them. And to get more details about the materials I'm using and the measurements, please check the description box. So to get cutting, I need to fold my fabric into 4, as you can see. And you're going to check the hip first. When you check the hip, you now add 5 to 6 inches, and that tells you that the fabric you have is going to be adequate. So I'm going to be making a size 16 yoke double flared kaftan dress. So to start, I'm going to cut off the selvage because I don't want those writings appearing on my dress at the end of the day. So now, because it's going to be a yoke dress, I need to take off what I'm going to add and check my length to make sure that it's going to be sufficient. So once that has been established and you're okay, all you want to do is to take your measurements for your kaftan double flared sleeve yoke dress. So I'm going to check the bust, divide by 4. Then if you want your dress to be fitted, all you need to do is to mark, as you regularly mark your dress, the bust, the waist, and the hip. So then you sew, then you're going to cut along those dots. So from the hip, it goes out like an A line. So that's what I'm just trying to show you, if that's what you like. But for me, I'm not going to be cutting the top fitted. I want it to be A from the top. And so I'm going to get my ruler and I'm going to just make my A starting from the bust. I'm going to connect the bust all the way to the hip. Then from the hip, I'm going to start going outwards so I create my A illusion. So as it goes downwards, it's wider. So that's why I had to add 6 inches so that I will have 1 inch for my seam allowance at the bottom. So once you've created your A line, you want to add your ease or your sewing seam allowance. So I'm adding 1 inch. You can decide to add 2 inches. So do what works for you. If you know your weight fluctuates here and there, or you're making for a client, then you need to add 2 inches. Just in case maybe you didn't get the measurements right, you can always open up. But when you be sewing for long and you hardly make mistakes, then you can add just 1 inch and that will be okay. So once you've done that, you need to take off the fabric, what you don't need, what you've cut off, and that gives you a clear picture of what you have on the table. If you see the way I'm using my fabric, it was well thought out. I have the boulder print at the bottom and I have the flowery part on top. So I'm going to fold that aside. Now I'm going to get my tulle or my net. They're inexpensive, but you want to make sure you go for a quality one, because if you don't buy a quality one, what happens is that it starts to tear or it has holes which you won't like. And I'm using a stretchy one, so you need to check the stretch direction of your fabric or your fabric grain to make sure that you get it right, because you don't want to be sewing in the wrong direction. So now I've folded into 4. What I provisioned for my yoke for the top of my dress is 8 inches, but I cut 16 inches in order to be able to get my facing, because I'm going to be using the tool to make the facing, so it's going to be double on top. But you can decide to just use a bias trimming for yours. There's no other fast rule as to what you can use. So I'm going to divide this into 2, and I have 4 pieces at the end of the day. So 2 to add to the dress in the initial sewing, and the other 2 to double it later on. So don't forget, this is just my perspective of on how I cut my own yoke dress. People cut theirs in different ways. It doesn't mean it's wrong, but it's just different approaches to the same thing. So you can see my net is a bit longer than the top of my dress. So I'm going to reduce that a little. I always prefer not to cut exactly what I need. After adding, I can always trim. So you can see now I'm going to trim off the excess. Then I'm going to fold back the piece of fabric, the front and the back block, and I'm going to place them together. So now I'm adding the other piece. So just put them together. Now I'm going to, so you can see, I'm going to try to cut my neckline and my shoulder. Now when you're using tulle, make sure your shoulder is not, if your shoulder is 16, normally you would do 17, but because it's tulle and it's stretchy, you don't want to do 17, you do 16, because if it's a bit smaller, now it sits better. And that's what I'm doing. Now I'm going to get the length of my armhole. I'm using the regular armhole for a size 16, which is 9 inches. If you don't know how to measure them, then you need to check my earlier video. So now I'm going to use my curved ruler to create my armhole. You can just use your chalk, and if you don't have one, and create the illusion of the armhole, but it's easier when a beginner to use a curved ruler. It makes your job faster and more exact. So now that's my armhole, and after I've cut the armhole, I can now go ahead to cut my neckline. But first and foremost, I want to mark the depth. I'm going to use 3.5 by 3.5 inches, and this is because, as I said earlier, the tulle fabric I'm using is a stretch one. So if you're not careful after cutting, it may be too wide. So it's better to go small, then you can always make it bigger if it doesn't work, than to go big and then it's going to be problematic to make it work. So that's my neckline. So now I'm going to cut the back 2 inches deep. I don't want the back and the front to be equal. Now I'm going to lift up the front piece and bring down the front neckline. Next, I will need to create my shoulder slope, taking 1 inch from the outward part of the shoulder all the way to the neckline, but you shouldn't cut anything off the neckline, remember. And what this does is it helps avoid crease around the armhole. So I just want to check my bust again. I always like to do this when I sew, and to see if the allowance I left was too big, and I noticed it was too big at the top. So I'm just going to make that 1 inch, and so I'm taking off that little piece. So if you want to add a pocket, you can also add a pocket to your dress. It's allowed. So now I want to cut the facing to make the net or the tulle on the neckline double. So when it's double, that way it gives it more durability. It makes it more solid as opposed to just one sheer fabric. It's very tricky cutting with tulle, so you don't want to be in a hurry. Take your time. If you need to use pins, then by all means use pins to hold them down. So that's the back piece. So before I take off the back piece, and cut the front piece lining on the top. I want to measure the pocket where I have my pocket, so I would just measure and notch that so that it's on the same level. Now I can take off one of the pieces and now cut the front piece. So make sure everything is on the same point, is even. Then go ahead and cut just around using the main body of the dress as your pattern. You just cut around it. Don't be afraid to try cutting with tool. All it needs is precision and a little bit of attention, and you should be fine. So you can also decide to use bias trimming for your neckline if you don't want to double the neckline. So now I'm going to put this aside, and we're going to cut the sleeve. Now you can decide which parts. If you have double tone fabric like mine, you can decide to choose what side of the fabric you want to use. I want it to look just like the body, so I'm going to be using the small flowery prints for the top part of my double flare sleeve. So I'm going to cut 10 inches plus 1, 11, because you need to divide and subtract the length of your sleeve. So I'm going to cut the top part. After sewing is going to be 10, then my flare is going to be 8 inches, the longest flare. So you need to calculate that when you're cutting your sleeve. So I'm cutting 11 because after sewing, half inch goes to the shoulder, half inch goes into the joining, so it becomes 10. So I have 10 on the top, and I'm going to need 8 for the longest part of the sleeve and 6 for the shorter part of the sleeve. So now I've created my armhole. If you don't know how to cut a sleeve, or you have issues when you cut a sleeve, check out one of my earlier videos on how to cut a shirt sleeve. It's a basic kind of sleeve you need to know if you are to be able to sew well. So I left 1 inch for my seam allowance. I'm going to take off the selvage as usual. Then I'm going to notch the top of my sleeve. You notch so that when you want to start sewing, it can be aligned. You know what parts are to the shoulder. So now I'm going to cut the flare. So the first layer of the flare is going to be my African print fabric. The second layer I'm going to use my black satin fabric. So the first layer, remember I said I'm going to cut 6 inches, sorry. So I need to make it 7 inches because half for the folding at the bottom and half to join to the top sleeve. So after that it becomes 6. So to create the circumference of the flare, what I do first, I just use 4 inches all around, and I'll use my tape to check if it's going to be okay. If it's not, all I need to do is to push down my fold. So I'm going to refold just a little more. Then I'm going to make it wider to accommodate my round sleeve. Remember, it's the bottom of the sleeve that determines how big the circumference of your flare needs to be. So now I have adjusted that and it's perfect. So I'm going to cut. Now, after cutting the top of the flare, I'm going to measure and create the flare. So just use your scissors and cut around the dotted lines that you created from your measurement. And I'm going to open this up. You may decide not to open it up, but I always prefer to open it up just in case I need to make some adjustments later on. It's easier that way. But you can also leave the flare the way it is. So remember, it's my perspective. Okay, so I'm checking to make sure it's the same. Yes, it's the same. So now I'm going to get my satin. I'm going to fold into 4 to cut a full circle, just like I did with the Ankara fabric. So I'm going to use the first layer of the flare as a pattern, so I don't need to go measuring again. All I need to measure is the length of the second. So all I need to do is add 2 inches long, make it 2 inches longer using my tape from the bottom of the flare. And that's what I'm doing. It makes it faster and more accurate. So once you've done that, you get your scissors. You just create your line, connect the dotted lines with your chalk. When you do that, it's easier to trace along the line, so you just use your scissors to cut. And I place your hand on the fabric, because sometimes when you start cutting, you may just miss the mark. But like you see, I placed my hand so it prevents the fabric from moving in all directions. So always remember that. So now we have the length of our satin flare for the double flared sleeve. Now I'm going to cut the top also using the Ankara as my pattern. So you can decide to use bias trimming to turn the bottom, but I'm going to be using lining, because when you use lining, it's neater. So I'm going to get a matching lining, and I'm going to cut the exact sizes of the flare, and I'm going to stitch the lining at the bottom on each of them before I add to the sleeve. So we're going to add to the sleeve like this at the end of the day. Then later add our ruched tulle like you saw in the intro picture. So now I'm cutting my tulle. I cut 6 inches wide by 72 inches long tulle. So on fold it becomes 3, but when you open it's 6 inches. So I need 3 of these strips of tulle or net fabric to make the frills for the sleeves. I have 2 for each of, 1 for the sleeve, 1 for the right, 1 for the left. That's 2 for both sleeves, then 1 for the top of the dress. So that means I need to cut 3 of this length. If you want yours to be bolder, by all means make it bolder. If you want it to be thinner or tinier, it's also possible. So what I would do is close the sides of this tulle. I'll sew, close the sides, then I will turn inside out. Then I'm going to run a loose stitch in the middle. Make sure where you have the joining is in the middle. So you run a stitch in the middle and you pull together to form your fronts. So this is my lining. I always cut my lining longer than the flare. And what this does is it keeps you safe. So after you must have turned the bottom, you can now adjust and cut on the same level. So you can see I've made my fronts. Now I am adding the fronts to the dress, to the front piece, before I'm going to close up the dress. So you need to add the fronts on the sewing, on the stitch where you add the joining between the tulle and the African print or Ankara fabric. So you take your time and you sew that in a way that it's aligned, it's straight. Okay, make sure it's on the stitch. So you do the same thing to the sleeves. On each of the sleeves, on the joining, you need to stitch these fronts on it. Once you've done that, you can close your sleeves, you can close the dress, join the shoulder, and voila, your dress is ready. So that's the tutorial for today. I hope you learned something new. I hope you enjoyed the tutorial. If you did, please don't forget to give me a thumbs up and leave me comments. Let me see what you've done. I love to read from you. And don't forget to subscribe. So till I see you